There are places in this world where civilization never fully arrived, where roads end without warning, where the trees grow so thick that sunlight becomes a rumor, where entire communities exist, have always existed, just beyond the reach of law, of government, of anyone who might ask uncomfortable questions. The Appalachian Mountains are one of those places. Stretching nearly 2,000 miles from Alabama all the way up into Canada, the Appalachians are the oldest mountain range in North America, older than the Atlantic Ocean, older than dinosaur bones. So old, geologists say, that when they were young, they rivaled the Himalayas in height. But time wore them down. Time and secrets. Because nestled inside those ancient ridges, buried beneath centuries of fog and forest and deliberate forgetting, there are stories that the mountains themselves seem reluctant to give up. Stories passed in whispers between sheriffs and rangers and old-timers who grew up in the hollers, the deep, isolated valleys where outsiders rarely ventured and sometimes never returned. You are about to hear one of those stories. And before we go any further, you need to understand something. This is not a fairy tale. This is not a campfire exaggeration. What you are about to learn is drawn from documented accounts, folklore investigations, criminal records, and the kind of oral history that survives precisely because it is too disturbing to be invented. Stay with me, because the deeper we go into these mountains, the darker it gets. Imagine you are a traveler. The year is somewhere in the mid-1800s. The exact date doesn't matter, because out here, dates don't matter much. There are no calendars nailed to these walls, no newspapers folded on these porches. Out here, time moves the way the mountains move, slowly, imperceptibly, and entirely on its own terms. You've been walking for 2 days. Your boots are soaked through. Your provisions ran out somewhere around the last ridge, and the next town, if you can call it that, is still another day's walk through terrain that seems designed to disorient you. The trails double back on themselves. The landmarks repeat. The fog rolls in at noon and refuses to lift. And then, through the trees, you see it. A light. A fire glowing amber through the gaps at a rough-hewn cabin wall. The smell of wood smoke and something else, something cooking. Your stomach turns over with hunger so sharp it almost feels like pain. You knock on the door. A face appears. Hard eyes. A slow smile. "Come in, stranger. You look half dead. Sit yourself down. Supper's nearly ready." You sit down. You eat. And you are grateful, so deeply, desperately grateful, that you don't think to ask what's in the pot. Not until much, much later. The Appalachian Mountains have always had a complicated relationship with the outside world. When the first European settlers pushed into these ridges in the 17th and 18th centuries, they were largely Scottish-Irish immigrants, tough, fiercely independent people who had already survived religious persecution, forced migration, and generational poverty. They came to the mountains because the mountains asked nothing of them. No landlords, no kings, no church telling them how to live or die. They built their cabins in the hollers, those narrow, shadowed valleys between ridges, and they stayed, generation after generation, marrying within small communities, trading with each other, developing their own dialects, their own medicine, their own laws. And when the outside world tried to reach in, tried to tax them, draft them, civilize them, they pushed back, hard. This isolation was, in many ways, their greatest strength. But isolation is a two-edged blade. Because when you cut yourself off from the world, you also cut yourself off from oversight, from accountability, from the basic social contract that, fragile as it is, keeps the worst of human nature in check. In the deepest hollows of Appalachia, that contract was never signed. And in some places, some very specific, very documented places, what grew in its absence was something that most people would prefer to believe is impossible. The name most associated with Appalachian cannibalism, the name that rangers and historians and true crime researchers keep coming back to, is one that has been deliberately obscured over the years, protected, some say, by local communities who don't want the association, buried, others claim, by officials who found it easier to look away than to pull on a thread that might unravel something far larger. But the stories survive. They always do. The earliest documented whispers come from the late 18th century, travelers going missing along certain mountain routes, search parties finding nothing, no bodies, no belongings, just absence where a person used to be. And occasionally, near certain remote homesteads, the faint, sickening familiarity of what was cooking over the fire. Investigators who dug into these accounts, and there were investigators, brave and methodical ones, began to notice patterns. The missing were almost always outsiders, travelers, traders, people passing through rather than people rooted to the land, people who would not immediately be missed, people whose disappearance could be explained by accident, a fall, a river crossing gone wrong, the simple cruelty of mountain weather. And the families at the center of these whispers shared certain traits. They were deeply isolated, even by Appalachian standards. They traded minimally with neighboring communities. They were rarely seen in town. Their children, when glimpsed, were pale and watchful and did not play the way children play. Their homesteads sat at the ends of roads that weren't on any map, and when strangers asked about them, casually, carefully, the locals would go quiet in a very specific way. Not the quiet of ignorance, the quiet of people who know something they have decided not to say. Now, before we go further, I need to address something directly, because whenever stories like this surface, two things happen simultaneously. First, people dismiss them as legend, as mountain mythology, as the kind of story that rural communities invent to explain disappearances that are really just the result of harsh terrain and hard winters. And second, and this is the part that should unsettle you, the documented evidence quietly contradicts that dismissal. Because this is not legend, not entirely. The case of Sawney Bean, the Scottish cannibal clan said to have killed and consumed over 1,000 people in the caves of Ayrshire, reached the shores of America with the Scottish-Irish immigrants who settled Appalachia. It was part of their cultural memory, part of the dark folklore they carried across the Atlantic like a stone in the pocket. Whether Sawney Bean was entirely real or partially mythologized is a debate historians still have. But the behavior he represented, family-based, geographically isolated, predatory cannibalism, was real enough that it survived in the storytelling tradition of the very people who built their homes in the Appalachian hollers. It was a warning, or perhaps, and this is the thought that makes the skin prickle, it was an instruction manual. And some families, historians now believe, took careful notes. Let me tell you about a specific account. The year is 1892. A county sheriff in western North Carolina, a man I'll call Sheriff Aldous because his real name has been obscured in the records in a way that itself raises questions, receives a report from a traveling merchant. The merchant is shaken. He cannot look directly at anyone when he speaks, and what he describes to the sheriff in a low, fractured voice is this. He had been traveling a back route through the mountains, a route he'd taken before, usually without incident. But this time, his horse went lame 3 miles from anywhere. As darkness came down fast, the way it does in the mountains, like a curtain being pulled, he spotted a homestead off the trail. He approached, knocked, and was welcomed by a man and woman of indeterminate age, weathered the way mountain people are weathered, and their adult children, 3 of them, 2 men and a woman, who watched him from the corners of the room with an attention that felt less like hospitality and more like assessment. He was given food. He ate. He was shown a sleeping area near the fire. He didn't sleep. Something was wrong, and he couldn't name it. The way the family spoke to each other in something just below English, a dialect thicker than anything he had encountered, almost its own language. The smell of the place beneath the wood smoke, and a door at the back of the cabin padlocked, from which came, he was almost certain, a human sound. At some point in the early hours while the family slept, he left. He walked through darkness and rough terrain for hours until he hit a road he recognized. He didn't stop moving until he reached town. Sheriff Aldis took down the account, rode out to investigate the location. He found the homestead. He found the family. And, according to the one
There is a particular kind of silence that investigators learn to recognize. It is not the silence of a dead end. It is not the silence of a case with no evidence, no leads, no thread to pull. It is the silence of a case where someone, or many someones, made a deliberate decision to stop talking. That is the silence that surrounds the deep history of Appalachian disappearances. And once you learn to recognize it, once you understand what that silence means, you start to see it everywhere. In the gaps between official records, in the sealed files, in the county archives where pages have been removed so carefully that you almost don't notice they're gone. In the way certain local historians change the subject with a practiced, almost rehearsed smoothness when you ask the wrong questions. The silence is not accidental. The silence is the story, and today, we break it. To understand what was truly possible in the isolated hollows of 19th century Appalachia, you first need to understand just how complete that isolation was. We use the word isolated casually. We apply it to cabins without Wi-Fi, to towns without a Starbucks. We have lost, in the modern world, any real felt sense of what true geographic and social isolation means, what it does to communities, to families, to the human mind over generations. So let me give you the real picture. In the mid-1800s, significant portions of the Appalachian interior had no roads. Not bad roads, no roads. Travel between communities was done on foot or horseback along trails that shifted with the seasons, washed out in spring, froze over in winter, and were navigable only by people who had spent their entire lives learning them. The nearest town for many of these families was not a day's walk away, it was a week's walk away. And town might mean nothing more than a general store, a church, and a handful of houses. There was no postal service reaching into the deep hollers, no telegraph, no census taker foolish enough to go in alone. Law enforcement, such as it was, operated at the county level, and county sheriffs in remote Appalachian regions were often managing territories the size of small European countries, with minimal staff, minimal resources, and an unspoken understanding that certain parts of their jurisdiction were best left to govern themselves. This was not neglect exactly, it was pragmatism. And it created, in the deepest parts of the mountains, something that functions for all practical purposes as ungoverned territory. Now put a family in that territory, a family already inclined toward insularity, already suspicious of outsiders, already operating by a moral code shaped entirely by survival and by the specific, brutal logic of mountain poverty. And then take away, gradually, over generations, any external check on their behavior. What do you get? You get what the mountains have been whispering about for 200 years. The most well-documented case in this dark tradition, and the one that researchers keep returning to as a possible template for what existed in the American mountains, is, as I mentioned in Part 1, the legend of Sawney Bean. But I want to linger here because the Bean case is more important than most people realize. Alexander Sawney Bean, according to Scottish historical accounts dating to the early 15th century, was the patriarch of a clan that lived in a coastal cave system in Ayrshire, Scotland, for an estimated 25 years, surviving almost entirely by robbing and consuming travelers on the road between Edinburgh and the coastal towns. The clan, at its height, allegedly numbered over 40 members, children and grandchildren, many of them the product of incest within the cave system itself. They ambushed travelers at night. They stripped the bodies. They preserved the flesh using methods that the historical accounts describe in terms I'll leave deliberately vague, because this is the kind of detail that the mind resists but the stomach remembers. The case, real, mythologized, or somewhere in between, was widely known in Scotland and Ireland for centuries before the first Scots-Irish settlers crossed the Atlantic. It was, essentially, a cultural memory of what extreme isolation and moral collapse could produce. And here is the thing about cultural memories. They don't just warn you. Sometimes, for certain kinds of minds, they inspire you. Now let's talk about names, because you came here for specifics, and specifics are what separate genuine historical investigation from campfire storytelling. The name that appears most frequently in serious research into Appalachian cannibal accounts is not a single family name, but a pattern of family names, families that appear in multiple independent accounts across multiple decades in overlapping geographic regions. The most significant of these centers on the region where Kentucky, Virginia, and West Virginia converge, an area so remote in the 19th century that it was sometimes referred to by local officials as the Dark Corner, not a formal designation, an acknowledgement. Within this region, beginning in the 1850s and running through documented accounts into the early 20th century, a cluster of disappearances was recorded that defied easy explanation. Traveling merchants, itinerant preachers, men whose whole purpose was to move between communities, land surveyors sent in from outside interests to map territory for potential railroad development, who simply stopped filing reports. The official explanations were consistent: accidents, harsh weather, criminal robbery by unknown parties. The mountains were dangerous, people died. But there was a county clerk, a meticulous, almost obsessive record keeper, named in the archives only by his initials, JPW, who began in the 1870s to compile something unofficial, a private ledger, cross-referencing disappearance reports with known homestead locations, mapping the routes the missing had been traveling against the locations of isolated family compounds. JPW was not a detective, he was a clerk. He had no authority to investigate, no power to compel testimony, but he had access to records, and he had, clearly, a mind that could not let a pattern go unexamined. His ledger survived, partially. What remains of it identifies by approximate location and physical description 3 distinct family compounds in the Dark Corner region that appear across multiple independent disappearance reports spanning nearly 3 decades, with a frequency that JPW himself, in his tight clerk's handwriting, described as beyond the reach of coincidence. He never named the families directly. Whether this was caution, incomplete knowledge, or something more ominous, a warning received, perhaps, we cannot know. But he mapped the locations, and 2 of those 3 locations, when cross-referenced with later 20th century investigations into Appalachian oral history, correspond to homesteads that local communities already knew about, already feared, already refused to speak of openly. I want to introduce you to a researcher named James Zanders. Zanders was not an academic, not officially. He was a journalist, the kind of deeply unfashionable, obsessively thorough journalist that the pre-internet era occasionally produced, the kind who spent years on a single story because the story wouldn't let him go. In the late 1970s, Zanders began interviewing elderly residents of the tri-state region, people in their 80s and 90s, people who had grown up in the mountain communities in the early 20th century and who carried in their memories the living residue of oral traditions that were already dying. He published almost nothing during his years of research, one short piece in a regional magazine in 1981, a letter to a historical society that was never formally acknowledged. But his notes, hundreds of pages of handwritten interview transcripts, were donated to a university archive after his death in 1997. And those notes contain, buried among accounts of folk medicine and lost dialects and forgotten community traditions, a series of testimonies that are, by any measure, extraordinary. One elderly woman interviewed in 1978, identified in the notes only as E.M., age 84, born in Buchanan County, told Zanders the following. She said that when she was a child, her mother had a rule, a single, absolute, non-negotiable rule, and the rule was this: you do not take the left fork after the second creek crossing. You go right. You always go right. And if someone you do not know invites you to stop, you do not stop. You say you are expected somewhere. You keep walking. You do not stop. E.M. had followed that rule her entire life without fully understanding it. She was in her 70s before she asked her older sister, then in her 90s near the end of her life, what the rule was actually about. Her sister told her, and E.M. told Zanders. What she described was a family, a specific family, a family whose name, she said, and here Zanders noted that E.M. lowered her voice even in the privacy of her own home, even with no one else present, was known throughout the surrounding.
There is a particular kind of courage that history rarely celebrates. Not the courage of battlefields, not the courage of speeches and declarations and moments witnessed by thousands. The quiet courage of a single person walking into darkness with nothing but a lantern and the stubborn, almost irrational conviction that the truth, whatever it turns out to be, is worth finding. His name was Edmund Farrow. He was 34 years old, a land surveyor by profession, employed by a Cincinnati-based railroad development company that was, in 1887, systematically mapping potential routes through the Appalachian interior of Virginia and Kentucky. He was methodical, experienced, and, by all accounts from colleagues who knew him, possessed of a calm, almost scientific fearlessness about remote terrain. He had surveyed river gorges. He had mapped ridge lines that no cartographer had previously recorded. He had spent weeks alone in territory that most men would not enter in groups. Edmund Farrow was not a man who frightened easily. On the 14th of October, 1887, he filed a preliminary survey report from a small post office in a town at the edge of the mountain interior. The report was routine. He outlined his planned route for the following 2 weeks, a detailed itinerary that took him deeper into the tri-state region along a series of ridges and creek crossings that corresponded, though Farrow could not have known this, almost exactly to the territory that JPW's private ledger had been quietly mapping for the previous 15 years. He signed the report, he posted it. He walked back into the mountains. And Edmund Farrow was never seen again. His disappearance did not at first trigger alarm. Surveyors in remote territory missed their check-in dates regularly. Terrain was unpredictable, weather turned, routes had to be rerouted. The railroad company waited 3 weeks before filing a missing persons report with the relevant county sheriff, and the sheriff, a practical man named Thomas Collier, who had been managing this particular county for 11 years, initially filed it under the same category as a dozen other similar reports from the previous decade. Missing in the mountains, presumed lost. But Edmund Farrow's employer was not a small operation. It was a well-funded Cincinnati company with attorneys and investors and a board of directors who did not accept presumed lost as a satisfactory conclusion when a valued employee vanished on company time. They hired a private investigator. His name was Clement Marsh,
And Clement Marsh, methodical, tenacious, and possessed of a journalist's instinct for the detail that doesn't fit, is the reason we know what we know about what happened in that hollow in the autumn of 1887. Marsh arrived in the region in December of 1887. He spent the first 2 weeks doing what good investigators always do first, not looking for the missing man, but listening to the people who knew the territory. He visited the post office where Farrow had filed his last report. He spoke to the postmaster, to the general store owner, to the 2 or 3 farmers whose land abutted the mountain interior. He was careful, methodical, and, crucially, he did not announce what he was looking for. He presented himself as a company representative, simply trying to reconstruct Farrow's route, to understand where the survey work might have taken him. What he heard in pieces over those 2 weeks assembled itself into a picture that he described in his investigation notes as a coherent geography of fear. Multiple people, independently, without apparent coordination, steered him away from a specific section of the interior. Not directly. No one said, "Do not go there." It was subtler than that. Routes were suggested that conspicuously bypassed a particular creek valley. When Marsh asked about a specific trail junction that appeared on Farrow's preliminary map, a junction that, based on the surveyed route, Farrow would almost certainly have reached, conversations changed direction with a fluency that spoke of long practice. One man, an elderly farmer whose property sat at the outermost edge of the interior, was more direct. He told Marsh that the valley beyond the second creek crossing was not a place for outside men. Marsh asked him what he meant. The old farmer was quiet for a long time. Then he said carefully and precisely that there was a family in that valley, that they had been there longer than anyone could remember, that they were not right, and he used that phrase with a deliberateness that suggested he had chosen it very carefully, that it was doing a great deal in a very small space. He told Marsh that travelers had gone missing in that area for as long as he could remember, that this was known, that this had always been known. Marsh asked him why no one had done anything about it. The old farmer looked at him for a long moment. "Son," he said, "what would you have us do? Go in there? And then what? Who comes looking for us?" Clement Marsh went in anyway. He did not go alone. He persuaded Sheriff Thomas Collier, who had, over the course of Marsh's 2 weeks of interviews, become progressively less comfortable with what was accumulating in the investigator's notebook, to accompany him with 2 deputies. They entered the valley on a Tuesday morning in early January 1888. The ground was frozen hard. The creek crossings were manageable. The trail, such as it was faint but followable, the kind of path made not by deliberate construction, but by the repeated passage of feet over decades. It took them the better part of a day to reach the compound. I use the word compound deliberately because that is the word Marsh used in his report, and it is the right word. This was not a single cabin, it was a collection of structures, 4 or 5 rough buildings arranged in a loose cluster around a central clearing, connected by covered walkways that suggested a community long settled and, in its own way, well organized. There was a main structure, larger than the others, with a stone chimney smoking steadily in the cold air. There were outbuildings, a barn of sorts, a structure with no windows that Marsh noted carefully in his report. And there was silence, the kind of silence that a place has when it has been warned of your approach. They were met at the edge of the clearing by a man. Marsh described him as follows, and I'm paraphrasing his notes here, not quoting directly, because the original language is somewhat archaic. A large man, past middle-aged, with a beard gone fully white and eyes of a pale color that Marsh found difficult to describe, except to say they did not look at you the way most people's eyes look at you. They assessed, catalogued, and revealed nothing in return. He gave his name. Marsh recorded it, but in a way that is unfortunately illegible in the surviving copy of the report. Water damage, archivists believe, though at least one researcher has suggested the damage is not entirely natural.
What followed was a conversation that Marsh described as one of his most disorienting experiences of his professional life, not because the man was threatening, not because he was overtly hostile, but because he was cooperative in a way that felt entirely wrong. He answered questions smoothly. He knew nothing of any missing surveyor. He and his family kept to themselves. They caused no trouble. They wanted no trouble. He invited them inside. Marsh and Sheriff Collier exchanged a look. They went inside. The interior of the main structure was, by Marsh's account, clean, orderly. A large central room with a fire, rough-hewn furniture, dried herbs hanging from the ceiling beams, the ordinary domestic architecture of a remote mountain household. There were other family members present. Marsh counted at least 7 adults, men and women, and noted the presence of children who watched from doorways with the particular stillness that he'd mentioned the old farmer describing. Not the curiosity of normal children encountering strangers, something more measured than that, more knowing. He was offered food. He declined, citing a recently eaten meal, a lie told with the ease of a man whose instincts were working faster than his conscious mind. Sheriff Collier, he noted, also declined. The deputies accepted. Marsh wrote in parentheses in his notes, and this parenthesis, this small bracketed observation, is the detail that serious researchers consider the most significant entry in the entire document. He wrote, parenthetical. Deputies ate without apparent concern. I could not eat. I do not know why I could not eat. I believe my body understood something my mind had not yet named. They found nothing on that first visit, nothing that could be called evidence, nothing that could be acted upon. But Marsh asked, carefully and casually toward the end of the visit, if he might look around the property, just to satisfy himself for the company's report. The white-bearded man agreed with that same unsettling smoothness and accompanied them personally on a brief tour of the outbuildings. The windowless structure, the one Marsh had noted at arrival, he was told, was a smokehouse, used for curing and storing meat through the winter. He asked if he might look inside. The white-bearded man paused. Just a pause, a fraction of a second longer than a pause should be. Then he unlocked it. Inside, Marsh recorded, preserved meat in quantity, the smell overwhelming, smoke and salt, and something beneath those smells that I could not and did not try to identify with precision. Haunches and joints hung from the ceiling beams, wrapped in cloth. Nothing visibly identifiable as anything other than what it was claimed to be. He wrote one more line about the smokehouse. He wrote, I counted the wrappings. There were more than a family of this size would need to survive a...
Science is not a comfortable thing. Not really. Not when you push it far enough. We like to think of science as clean, orderly, a process that takes the chaotic, disturbing rawness of reality and organizes it into something manageable, something that can be written in a report, filed in a cabinet, cited in a paper. But there is a branch of science, a specific, necessary, quietly devastating branch whose entire purpose is to sit with the most uncomfortable evidence imaginable and refuse to look away. Forensic anthropology. The science of reading human remains, of listening to bones the way other scientists listen to data, carefully, methodically, and without flinching at what they say. And what bones say when they have been subjected to the specific processes of human cannibalism is unmistakable. It cannot be misread. It cannot be explained away. It is written in the physical structure of the remains themselves, in marks so precise, so specific, so deliberate, that forensic anthropologists can distinguish with a high degree of certainty between the damage done by animals, by the environment, by ordinary decomposition, and the damage done by human hands, human tools, and human fire. Today, we apply that science to what Harold C. Baines found in that clearing in 1911, and what it tells us is not something you will easily forget. Let me walk you through the forensic markers of cannibalism, not in abstract terms, but in the specific, technical language that researchers use, because that precision matters. Because precision is the difference between a ghost story and a documented reality. When human remains have been processed for consumption, they bear what forensic anthropologists call perimortem modifications, changes to the bone that occurred at or around the time of death, as opposed to changes caused by later decomposition or environmental factors. The first and most definitive marker is cut marks. These are fine, linear incisions on the bone surface made by a sharp implement, a knife, a stone tool, a blade of any kind during the process of defleshing. They appear in specific locations, along the shafts of long bones, around joint surfaces, on the interior of the pelvis, along the mandible. Their pattern follows the logic of butchery. They appear where muscle attaches to bone, where flesh would be systematically removed. They are completely distinct from animal tooth marks, which have a different geometry, a different depth profile, a different distribution pattern. When a forensic anthropologist sees cut marks in those locations, in those patterns, there is only one explanation. A human being processed this body. The second marker is percussion fractures. Long bones, the femur, the humerus, the tibia, when broken by deliberate, forceful impact, fracture in a characteristic way. The fracture pattern is helical, smooth-edged, with percussion notches, small impact scars at the point where the blow landed. This fracture pattern is what you produce when you break a bone to access the marrow inside. Marrow extraction, one of the oldest and most efficient methods of caloric recovery from a carcass. The third marker is burning patterns. Bones burned in a fire while still bearing flesh or immediately after defleshing burn differently than bones burned after full decomposition or burned dry. The color gradients are different. The cracking patterns are different. Forensic anthropologists can tell from a burned bone fragment whether it was burned fresh or burned dry, and that distinction tells you whether the fire was used for cooking or for disposal. Sometimes both. These three markers, cut marks, percussion fractures, burning patterns, constitute what researchers call the cannibalism taphonomic signature. When all three appear together on human remains in a consistent and patterned way, the conclusion is not a theory, it is a finding. Now, Harold C. Baines's 1911 forestry report described, in his own words, human skeletal fragments around the perimeter of a clearing with multiple fire pits. He was a forestry worker, not a scientist. He had no training in forensic anthropology, a discipline that, in 1911, was itself still in early development. But he was an observant man, an experienced outsman, and a person who had spent years working in terrain where animal remains were a routine part of the landscape. He knew the difference between deer bones and what he found in that clearing. He said so explicitly to James Zanders in 1979. Zanders, in his notes, recorded Baines's description of the fragments in enough physical detail that Zanders later, this is documented in his archive, consulted with a physical anthropologist at a mid-Atlantic university. The anthropologist's response was recorded verbatim. The characteristics as described, the linear incisions on the long bone shafts, the helical fracture patterns, the burning consistent with fresh bone, are consistent with what we would expect to see in a site used for the processing and consumption of human remains. I cannot make a definitive finding from a description, but I can tell you that nothing in what you've described is inconsistent with that conclusion, and several elements are highly suggestive of it. Highly suggestive. In scientific language, that is as close to yes as professional caution allows. But here is where the story shifts, because forensic evidence, as compelling as it is, tells you what happened. It does not tell you when it stopped. And in the case of the hollow in the tri-state region, the question of when it stopped,
or whether it stopped, is the question that occupied the final years of James Zander's life with an intensity that, by his own account, bordered on obsession. Because the compound did not decay naturally. Let me explain what I mean by that. When Zanders, in the early 1980s, managed to physically locate the site, guided by the combination of JPW's mapped coordinates, Baines's grid references, and the geographic descriptions in EM's testimony, what he found was not the expected picture of abandonment. Remote, abandoned structures in the Appalachian Mountains follow a predictable decay pattern. Without maintenance, roofs collapse within a decade or two under the weight of snow and the relentless pressure of mountain weather. Walls follow. Vegetation reclaims the cleared ground. Within 50 years, a cabin site is often identifiable only by the slight irregularity of the tree growth, younger trees filling the space where structures once stood, older trees forming a rough perimeter around where the clearing used to be. That is what natural abandonment looks like. That is not what Zanders found. What he found, and he documented this with photographs that are part of his archived materials, was a site that had been deliberately cleared. Not abandoned, cleared. The structures had been dismantled, not collapsed. The stone foundations, what remained of them, showed evidence of deliberate deconstruction, stones removed rather than fallen. The fire pits that Baines had documented in 1911 had been filled in and covered, imperfectly enough that Zanders could identify them from subtle ground depressions, but deliberately. Someone had tried to erase this place. Not time, not weather, not the indifferent entropy of the natural world. Someone. Zanders spent 3 visits to the site over 2 years. On his 3rd visit, in the spring of 1984, he found something that he had not found on the previous 2. A structure he had missed, or, and this possibility troubled him, a structure that had not been visible on the previous visits. It was set back from the main compound area, further into the tree line, partially obscured by decades of undergrowth. A small structure, more of a dugout than a building, built into the side of the ridge itself, with a stone and timber entrance frame that had partially collapsed, but not fully. Zanders described the approach to it in his notes with a level of visceral physical detail unusual for his typically restrained writing style. He described the smell, a deep, cold mineral smell with something organic underneath it, the way very old caves smell, the way very old things smell. He described the sound his boots made on the ground as he approached, different, he wrote, than the surrounding terrain, hollow almost. He described stopping at the entrance and, for the first time in 3 years of investigation, being genuinely unsure whether he wanted to continue. He continued. Inside the dugout, partially preserved by the constant cool temperature and the protection from weather, he found 3 things. The first was a collection of what appeared to be hand-fashioned tools, knives, hooks, implements of a type he could not immediately identify, made from metal and bone. The bone components, he noted, with the particular care of a man who has spent 3 years educating himself on the subject, were not animal bone. The second was a series of marks on the interior stone wall. Not writing, nothing as legible as writing, a system of marks, tallies possibly, rows of incisions cut into the stone with a sharp implement, grouped in clusters of varying sizes. Zanders counted the marks. He counted them 3 times because the first count seemed impossible.
We have come a long way together. From the amber glow of a cabin window glimpsed through dark trees, from the deliberate, practiced hospitality of a family whose warmth was a kind of trap, from the sealed reports and the silenced witnesses and the clerk who mapped coordinates that no one in authority wanted to look at too closely, from the bones in the clearing, from the oilcloth in the dugout, from the question that James Zanders wrote at the bottom of a page in small, careful handwriting, as if minimizing the size of the words might minimize the size of what they meant. We have arrived, now, at the hardest part. Not the history.
The history, as disturbing as it is, has the mercy of distance. It happened then, to them, in a world without roads and telegraphs and modern law enforcement, a world so different from ours that it is almost possible to file it away as a different species of reality. What we are about to discuss does not have that mercy. What we are about to discuss is closer, much closer. To understand what modern researchers have found and what they have been careful about how they say, you first need to understand a concept that sociologists and law enforcement professionals who work in remote Appalachian communities have been grappling with for decades. They call it legacy isolation. The term is precise and deliberately clinical, the way academic language is often deployed to contain things that in plain speech would be too raw to handle professionally. Legacy isolation refers to communities, families, extended kinship networks, sometimes loose collections of households that have maintained across multiple generations a degree of social and geographic separation from mainstream society so complete that their behavioral norms, value systems, and even their understanding of law and moral obligation have developed along entirely independent lines. These are not communities that rejected modernity and then remained static. They are communities that evolved in isolation, that developed their own internal logic, their own hierarchies, their own codes, over so many generations that the gap between their world and the world outside is not a gap that can be bridged by simply building a road or running a power line to their hollow. The gap is cultural, psychological, generational. And in the deepest, most remote sections of the Appalachian interior, researchers, social workers, and law enforcement officials who work in these regions will tell you, quietly and carefully, and always off the record, the gap is, in certain cases, profound enough to encompass behaviors that the outside world has not encountered in a domestic American context since the 19th century. I want to be precise here because precision matters. I am not saying that cannibalism is currently, actively, and documentably practiced by identified communities in the Appalachian Mountains. What I am saying, what the documented record supports, is something more nuanced and, in its own way, more unsettling. I am saying that the conditions which produced the family in that hollow, the isolation, the insularity, the multi-generational removal from external oversight, the development of independent moral codes, the specific predatory relationship with transient outsiders, those conditions have not been fully eliminated. They have been reduced, compressed, pushed further back into the interior as roads and infrastructure have penetrated deeper into the mountains, but not eliminated. A 2003 report by a coalition of Appalachian social service organizations, a report that received almost no mainstream attention, buried in the specialized literature of rural social work, identified what it called zones of persistent isolation in portions of Kentucky, Virginia, West Virginia, and Tennessee. Areas where, despite decades of rural development programs, certain family networks had maintained a degree of insularity that resisted every external intervention. The report was careful, measured. It was written by social workers, not criminologists, and its primary concern was with issues like access to health care, educational attainment, and domestic violence intervention. But in a section near the end, a section that reads between its careful professional lines like a document written by people who had seen things they were struggling to contextualize, it noted that in certain of these zones, local law enforcement had, over the preceding 2 decades, recorded a statistically anomalous pattern of unresolved missing persons cases that did not correspond to the environmental factors typically associated with rural disappearances. Statistically anomalous, unresolved. The report did not speculate further. It didn't need to.
In 2009, a retired sheriff's deputy from a county in southwestern Virginia, a man who had served for over 30 years in a region that overlaps geographically with the area we have been discussing throughout this story, gave an interview to a regional podcast focused on Appalachian history and folklore. The interviewer was not expecting what he got. The deputy, I'll call him by the name he used in the interview, Dale, because he gave only his first name, spoke for over an hour about his career. Routine stuff, mostly. Moonshine operations, domestic disputes, the particular challenges of policing an area where your jurisdiction technically extended to places that were practically speaking beyond your reach. And then, near the end of the interview, unprompted, Dale said something. He said that in his 30 years, he had personally investigated or attempted to investigate 4 separate incidents involving isolated family properties in the deep mountain interior that had left him, in his words, unable to close the file in his mind even after he closed it on paper. The interviewer asked him what he meant. Dale was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "There are places back in those hollows where, I don't care what century it is, I don't care what year it is on the calendar, the rules are different. Not just different from the law, different from anything most people would recognize as human behavior. And when you go in there and you come back out and you write your report, you write what you can prove because that's the job. But you know what you saw, and you know that the report doesn't contain it." The interviewer asked him directly, was he suggesting that what he encountered was comparable to historical accounts of cannibal communities in the region? Another pause, longer this time. "I'm suggesting, carefully, that history doesn't always stay in the past, not in those mountains. Some things just keep going. They keep going because nobody stops them. And nobody stops them because to stop them you'd have to go in there, and most people, most sensible people, decide that some things are better left alone. Some things are better left alone." That sentence is the through line of this entire story, isn't it? It's what the old farmer told Clement Marsh in 1887. What would you have us do? Go in there? It's what the deputy told Harold C. Baines in 1911 when he closed a case without visiting the site. Better for everyone. It's what the railroad company communicated to Marsh when he filed his report and never acted on it. What the county sheriff communicated when he took down the merchant's trembling account and filed it under presumed lost. What every layer of official indifference communicated across a century and a half of sealed records and redirected investigations and carefully worded reports that said everything except what they meant. Some things are better left alone. It is a sentence born of pragmatism, of resource limitation, of the honest acknowledgement that there are places where the machinery of law and civilization runs out of reach and runs out of will simultaneously. But it is also, and this is what we need to sit with in the final minutes of this story, it is also a sentence that protects something. Not the public, not the travelers and hikers and surveyors and merchants who wandered into the wrong hollow. It protects the thing in the hollow. Every time someone decided that some things are better left alone, they made a choice, an active, deliberate choice to allow something to continue. And the consequence of that choice, multiplied across generations, across counties, across the long, quiet decades between one Edmund Farrow and the next, is a historical record full of the specific, unmistakable shape of absence. People who were there, and then weren't. Let me bring this home, because I promised you at the beginning of this story that what you were about to hear was not legend, not campfire exaggeration. And I want to honor that promise in the final minutes by being as clear and direct as this story allows. What we know, documentably, verifiably, from primary sources and archived materials and the living testimony of people who were there, We know that in the tri-state region of the Appalachian interior, across a documented period spanning at least 1850 to 1931, a pattern of disappearances existed that multiple independent investigators, J.P.W., Clement Marsh, Harold C. Baines, and James Zanders, identified as connected to one or more isolated family compounds operating outside any legal or social oversight. We know that forensic analysis of the physical descriptions from those sites is consistent with, and in the professional judgment of at least one academic specialist, suggestive of the processing and